Hey everyone, I have something really special to share with you. I'm hosting my first ever virtual tarot conference this summer that I know you're going to love. It's called the Summer Solstice Summit, and it's happening the weekend of June 20th. It's going to be a 3-day online gathering filled with tarot, astrology, shadow work, creative ritual, and all things witchy wellness. I've brought together 15 incredible presenters, folks I truly admire, ranging from therapists who are using tarot therapeutically to psychologists, astrologers, and of course, some of the most innovative tarot thinkers. All of these folks will be leading workshops and presentations designed to nourish your spirit and deepen your tarot practice. So, whether you're new to using tarot, especially as a tool for self-discovery and healing, or if you've been on this path for years, this summit is meant to meet you exactly where you are. And everyone is guaranteed to walk away with some healing witchy wisdom. I hope you'll join us for the Summer Solstice Summit. Go ahead and visit thetarotdiagnosis.com/summer solstice to get your weekend pass. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. When we pull the Two of Cups, we often think about relationships, connection, closeness, some sort of emotional or vulnerable exchange with somebody else. It's a card that represents being seen, being witnessed, being cared for, and it's also a card of reciprocity, so doing all that for somebody else. And I've been thinking about this card a lot the last few weeks because it was one of those cards we discussed in the latest book club inside the tarot diagnosis community, the symposium. And we were specifically discussing it through the lens of Jessica Doerr's book, Tarot for Change. We had a lot to say about her interpretation. It was a really great discussion. All of our book club discussions are always fun and insightful, but yeah, we really peeled back the layers on this one. So in Tarot for Change, I just kind of want to summarize what Jessica Doerr says about the Two of Cups. So basically, she talks about how the Two of Cups asks us to consider this archetype as a mirror, one that reflects more of our unconscious in our world than we probably realize in relationships. And she talks about how when we're in a partnership, we don't just see the other person. We often see projections of our unmet needs, also our fantasies and the emotional scaffolding or emotional architecture that we have established in childhood. And she points out how it's far more common to enter into connections with someone else with the hope that they will be who we need them to be rather than who they actually are. And then she also goes on to elaborate about how this card speaks to how easily our past gets reenacted in our present relationships. So when things feel really great and euphoric or blissful, especially in the early stages of love or really even friendship, it doesn't have to just be romantic connections. It's not necessarily all just authentic chemistry. There's unfortunately some false compatibility due to the projections that inevitably happen when we're engaging with our partner. And so when things kind of fall apart, and not fall apart meaning the relationship crumbles, but kind of when the facade falls apart and the initial euphoria, all that new relationship energy starts to fade, that's when you get a little bit more of a clearer picture of really what's going on. And you're faced with the reality of, oh, maybe I was projecting because now I'm starting to notice I have a lot of unmet needs. I have some expectations that are not being met. And now I'm being forced to explore all of these exposed old wounds that I've never tended to. And we don't realize all of that is being carried along with us in interactions with people. And so that's when we often find ourselves like kind of fighting and in this push-pull conflict of a dynamic. But projection, it doesn't always show up in conflict. In fact, Jessica Dore talks about how it shows up with the people who we fall for, a certain type, or when we feel irrationally hooked, or when we're, unusually activated by somebody. These are all coping strategies, basically. Projection can be a coping strategy to deal with the emotions that we're experiencing, but that we don't know how to express or hold or tend to. So what happens is we experience them and we're like, oh shit, this is too much. So then we're like, here, take this. And we are projecting onto someone else. And we are basically kind of unconsciously assigning this role or responsibility that our partner is expected to or needs to carry and tend to the thing that we can't carry or tend to ourselves. One of my favorite ways to interact with tarot is to use it as a tool for question asking. Asking questions is one of my favorite things to do. It's probably why I love being a therapist. And a lot of times when we think of tarot, we think of pulling a card to receive an answer or to gain insight, which, yes, that absolutely is something that happens. And it's also a tool to formulate questions that we maybe really should be asking ourselves. So through the lens of Dore's interpretation of the Two of Cups, we could look at this card as an invitation to ask ourselves, what am I seeing in my partner or this person, whoever it may be, or what am I projecting, or what is this kind of big emotion that I am, kind of asking them to hold, pouring into their cup that might actually be about me, or might actually be something I need to look at and tend to. Because what's interesting is when we stop asking people to kind of hold our pain without realizing it, we actually give ourselves an opportunity to have a really true, authentic, intimate connection with somebody, and not one that is just based on the picture or the story that we've written about them, but actually a story that is written based on the reality of that person's experience in life and the reality of your experience in your life. So for the most part, I agree with the interpretations of the Two of Cups in Jessica Dore's framework. But it does really feel kind of like the shadow side of this card. And I think that was probably the biggest critique in the book club, was that folks were like, oh, it seems like there's this like negative focus on this card. And I think that honestly speaks to just the experience of tarot in general. Every single card in the deck, every single person in this world could relate to some degree. And yes, we absolutely can project our joy onto cards, but often we turn to tools like tarot when we are wanting to understand something that is confusing, or feel more content about something that has been uncomfortable, or to better understand our pain and our suffering. So I think it makes sense that Dore would spend so much time looking at the shadow component of the Two of Cups. And yeah, so all of that to say is, I guess that's probably the lens I'm going to be spending the most of my time looking through during this episode. Someone else I want to talk about, though, is Paul Quinn. And I really appreciate a line in Quinn's book, Tarot for Life, about the Two of Cups, because he says, quote, "The couple represents agreements, formal and otherwise, and the dependence on the other to fulfill them." So between Quinn and Dore's take on this card, I can't help but think about the dismissive-avoidant attachment style. And so if you've listened to this episode already, then you've got a little bit of a primer, but I did do an episode a while back on the different attachment styles. Highly recommend going and listening to that episode. It'll give you more context on the dismissive avoidant attachment style. But I couldn't help it. I just kept thinking about it when I was comparing these two interpretations and really trying to gain a personal, deeper understanding of the Two of Cups. And, when we're thinking about the dismissive avoidant style, I think that that style significantly complicates the projections that Dorr is talking about. And then also the experience of dependence that Quinn is basically alluding to in his interpretation. So to throw someone else into the mix, I also started thinking about Esther Perel. And I love Esther Perel. She's probably my favorite psychotherapist of all time. I think she's brilliant. I really love the way that she talks about relationships and our experience in relationships. And there's a quote, you've probably seen it, something that she's well known for saying is, when you pick a partner, you pick a story. And that story becomes the life you live. And essentially, the Two of Cups, I realized, functions as like a meeting space for the negotiation of the story that Perel is talking about. And something that's important about this meeting space that I feel like maybe we don't give enough kind of time or space to talk about is that it can feel really dangerous. It can feel really unsafe. But it's not that intimacy itself is feared because, obviously when you step into that space, it's an intimate environment. I think it's more so what's required of us when we step into that space that can feel so uncomfortable because it requires us to be vulnerable, dependent on somebody else, and to acknowledge that there will be both healed and a hell of a lot of unhealed parts of us that are going to be exposed as we continue to build a relationship with this other person. So if your inner dialogue or your kind of like inner narrative is riddled with self-talk that sounds something like, you're too this or you're too that, or you're not enough, or even they're too much or they're not enough, then, meeting at that space of the Two of Cups starts to look like this really risky, high stakes exchange. And then what happens is we start to view this exchange, start to view this meeting space as not necessarily a compassionate, curious negotiation, but more of a negotiation that might sound like, okay, well, I'll offer you my cup, but what if you think it's too heavy? Or, well, what if you ask me to hold yours and I feel like your cup is too heavy? And then what happens if I can't hold it anymore? Will I be a disappointment? And do you expect me to be able to hold everything that is in your cup or only some of it? And so we kind of play all of these what ifs in our head, which is why we kind of like find ourselves back to Dorr's interpretation of projection, because this person who's meeting us at this space might be entirely capable and even excited to hold all of those parts of us, even the undesirable parts, because they really care about us. But our projection, due to the experiences that we've had, makes us question their ability to hold our cup and stay in that space with us, or if they'll be able to follow through entirely. And much of this internal tug of war is deeply rooted in that specific attachment style. And while any attachment style can struggle with intimacy at times, I think the dismissive avoidant style is particularly relevant to this dynamic, because when you have this attachment style, you're way more likely to downplay the importance of relationships in general and way more likely to emphasize your independence. And you can feel really uncomfortable with, getting too close to somebody or someone relying on you, or you feeling like you have to rely on somebody else. And when we exist within that kind of attachment style space, it's usually because we've internalized this message that relying on someone else is unsafe or shameful. And that message usually stems from a real event that happened at some point in your life that made you feel like, or you actually did experience, closeness being unsafe or shameful. The tough part here is, folks who maybe are hanging out in that dismissive avoidant attachment style tend to be labeled as not wanting connection, hence dismissive, because somewhere along the line they learned that, again, connection comes with this really hefty emotional or physical cost. And then somewhere else along the line, they absorbed and started to kind of proudly display this narrative that being emotionally self-contained is the only safe way to exist. So basically this kind of idea that, okay, well, I'll hold my cup and you hold yours. And if you expect me to hold both my cup and your cup, then I'm going to run away. And, people with this attachment style often don't ask for the other partner to hold their cup at all because, again, they fear they either won't handle it with care or be able to hold it at all. And these folks feel like to ask for that level of care really just kind of feels like a violation of their kind of like internal emotional code of conduct. Really, don't need too much, don't reveal too much, or don't depend on others at all. But the reality and the truth is they truly feel the opposite inside because they very much want deep connection and really do want to be able to rely on others. And it's this paradox that can lead to cycles of pursuing closeness and then withdrawing because of, that longing expressed by the Two of Cups being eclipsed by the fear that is significantly clouding that meeting space. We can even see a relationship dynamic play out with the remainder of the cups when we're thinking about the Two of Cups in this regard. I mean, the Three of Cups is clearly representing the relationship being celebrated in those early stages when you're completely oblivious to your own projections and, kind of just believing that this person is everything that you need and want them to be. You're integrating them with your friend and family circles and everything's just great. But then the Four of Cups represents kind of starting to close yourself off from that emotional connection that the two offers. And then the Five of Cups represents the pain and resentment of that really is inevitable because you feel like you're not being held or cared for, even though you're not asking for help or to be held or cared for. And the Five of Cups could also represent the partner in this case, where they're grieving the inability to feel fully connected to the other partner. And then we have the Six of Cups, which could represent this kind of like reckoning of this dynamic, likely forming from unstable, unpredictable caregiver relationships. And then we have the Seven of Cups, which could represent kind of impulsivity or like that push-pull dynamic I was talking about. More of this kind of like internal dialogue of like, oh, well, look at all these other people, places, or things that could distract me from, working on this pain. Or it can also represent the projections that you're now like throwing out to this person. And then the Eight of Cups represents that kind of pulling away, literally leaving or disconnecting emotionally. And then the Nine of Cups could be this like prideful moment of, leaving and then being like, yes, I've regained my independence. See, I don't need anybody. I knew I couldn't rely on anybody. And then the 10 of Cups, hopefully being that kind of happy ending where they realize the attachment wound that's here and do some significant work around healing that. There's another bigger issue underlying all of this, though. And I think that it's this archetype of the devil. I feel like we have to kind of bring that into the mix here because I think that card paired with the devil paired with the Two of Cups almost paints this picture that intimacy equals being trapped, that needing somebody means losing yourself, and that, you're inevitably going to become enmeshed and, not know who you are separate of this other person. And yeah, that can get really messy and scary. And this distortion is super common among folks who have had to be overly self-reliant because they've learned to associate closeness with betrayal or loss of self. So, of course, they avoid any sort of true, what could be reciprocal connection. I think this is an important time to kind of reiterate something I mentioned earlier, though, that like all attachment styles, the dismissive-avoidant is absolutely a survival strategy. It is a coping mechanism. And it does often emerge due to these early relational experiences, usually as a child, but can happen in adolescence and adulthood. And it could be either explicit or implicit scenarios or situations where, this person believes that their emotional needs were burdensome, unwelcome, or they felt unsafe when they expressed those. So with this type of attachment style, I tend to see it most prevalent in folks where maybe growing up, their emotional expression was minimized or even discouraged. Like, don't cry. If you're going to cry, go to your room, or even punished. So, and a lot of times I'll see folks who will say, oh, well, no, my childhood was great. Like, my parents were wonderful. They, fed me, provided a house, sent me to school, put me in all the extracurriculars. But then when we start to explore the dynamics there, we realize that, oh, well, none of my emotional needs or expressions were ever tended to, or they were punished. Or maybe when they asked for comfort, they were met with like a level of indifference. So not even any sort of kind of like bad or negative interaction or punishment. It could have just been like, oh, you want a hug? Okay. And like a tap on the back. Or feeling, just like somewhat detached, or even like a parent who's like irritated when a child asks for comfort. And another kind of common experience I see with this is in families where independence was really praised and required. So, and kind of the implicit message and lesson here is that showing some sof need or, asking for help is seen as a failure. So it's getting praised for when you were able to, kind of handle everything on your own and, dealing with your emotions by yourself and avoiding asking for help. And what all of that teaches us, we basically learn that any sort of vulnerability or dependence on another person is bad. So what happens? You end up building all these kind of emotional walls. You adapt, you learn to suppress your needs, your feelings. And it's not because you don't have needs, but it's because expressing them historically meant that you would be neglected or feel even worse or feel shame. So eventually you just stop reaching out, you stop expecting any sort of reciprocity, and you lean into self-reliance. This actually reminds me very early on in my career, I was working a lot with families and children, and the majority of my research and what I was focusing on was the effects of trauma on children, both pre and post birth. And I remember reading study after study that was debunking this myth that you should just let a baby cry themselves to sleep, because somewhere along the line, people believed that when a baby is fed and they're really fine, but they're still crying, that they're manipulating you. But an infant doesn't have the ability to manipulate you. Their brain is not even close to being developed enough. But the point of all this in these studies about letting a baby cry themselves to sleep versus, going to hold them and tend to them when they were crying was very telling. The babies who were picked up each time they cried eventually starts crying less. And the babies who were not picked up and left to cry themselves to sleep also cried less. However, here's the outcome. Babies that were tended to every time they cried learned that they could rely on their caretakers to meet their needs. And the babies that weren't picked up learned that they couldn't rely on their caregiver to meet their needs. So they just stopped trying. And what's tragic about that whole scenario is it just breeds self-sufficiency in a maladaptive way. Because as adults, then these folks struggle with emotional intimacy, not because they don't want it, but because they've spent their lives trying to convince themselves that they don't actually need it. And I think this is where the Two of Cups really becomes poignant, because this is an archetype where closeness is desired. But when we think about the depth of this card, the fear that exists is so heavy, because there's this fear that existing in this Two of Cups space will somehow expose a part of yourself that you've spent most of your life trying to bury deep inside and away. And it's the part that still longs to be held, cared for, witnessed, and just accepted in all of your humanness. So, how do we work with this experience therapeutically and with tarot? There's a few different ways that we could do this. I think I would probably kind of lean into more compassion-focused therapy. It's, rooted in kind of evolutionary psychology and really highlights the experience of shame and self-criticism. So I think that's absolutely relevant in this scenario. And the goal is to really help folks develop a more compassionate self-image and compassionate self-narrative where, we challenge this internal dialogue of I'm not worthy, or I'm too much, or I don't need anybody. And then I'd also probably implement something like dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, because I think the Two of Cups embodies duality. And I think that's something that's really important that I haven't really addressed in this episode, just because I was really just wanting to talk about it through this lens of attachment theory. But when we talk about it through the lens of DBT, it would allow us to kind of both and the situation. Like, I want to be close to others and I value my independence, versus feeling like you have to choose one or the other. And then in a tarot context, I feel like we'd have to subscribe to temperance as the kind of main mode of treatment here, because temperance really teaches, again, that kind of like delicate balance of both and, balancing the self and the other person. And also there's an integration component in temperance, which I think is, really important in this scenario, because temperance reminds us that connection doesn't have to cost us our autonomy. It can actually enhance it, especially when it's done kind of mindfully and with mutual respect and understanding and curiosity. With temperance, we get to kind of experience a level of alchemy, especially in terms of relationships, if we're looking at it as being anchored by the Two of Cups, because we're combining or blending, whatever's in those cups, our experiences, our emotions, our attachment styles, whatever it may be, which is just similar to how we merge lives in general. But the alchemy that is happening in temperance, again, doesn't take away our autonomy or independence. So I think this archetype gives us an opportunity to explore how can we express our needs, step into the space, the meeting space, the negotiation space of the Two of Cups, and also still maintain some level of independence and autonomy, while also acknowledging that we are not a burden and that other people, the right people, actually enjoy witnessing us and holding space for us. I think in this case, temperance is kind of teaching us the art of integration, really. And again, how it's not this like either or dynamic, but more of a both and. So I kind of want to turn to tarot now and actually pull a card. I feel like I've been actively pulled a card in a little while, and I miss doing that. So Yeah, I want to just intuitively pull and maybe ask a question about how we can specifically, work through this dynamic that I just talked about. So I would recommend, and if you're going to pull alongside me, I would pull Temperance and the Two of Cups out as your anchors here. And I think it would be beneficial to pull for a question like, how can I hold both intimacy and autonomy when I'm uncomfortable? Yeah, so we'll do that because that's really what we've been talking about with this attachment style. This experience of fearing intimacy and fearing loss of autonomy, feeling like people can't hold space for us. So, how can I hold both intimacy and autonomy when I'm uncomfortable? Oh, this is lovely. The Page of Cups. Okay. So, pages embody curiosity. Like, doesn't matter which page it is, it's curious. And I love this because the pages are also kind of tender. They're very willing and eager to explore, even when something feels unfamiliar or complex. And with the Page of Cups specifically, I think that it's inviting us to kind of meet our discomfort. If we look at this card, when we've got this kind of like fish half out of the water, like clearly, like that feels uncomfortable. But the Page of Cups is kind of like, yeah, like this is cool. Let's see what's going on here. Which I think really speaks to the page meeting this discomfort with curiosity and not defensiveness or withdrawal that we might experience with the dismissive-avoidant attachment style. And I think something else with the pages is the pages don't have the answers. And a lot of times in relationships and life in general, we want to know, okay, what do I do? How do I deal with this? Where do I go from here? And the pages tell us that sometimes we don't know. There's sometimes we're in a space in our relationship, in our life where we feel like we have to know exactly what to do or what to say. And the Page of Cups, I think, is saying, hey, like, you don't have to be kind of entirely emotionally fluent or completely regulated at all times. I think the Page of Cups is saying, hey, let's just pay attention to what's happening here. And let's not rush to fix it or even rush to run away from it. Let's just hold it and observe it, because that's really what's happening in the imagery, at least the traditional imagery of the Page of Cups. This is actually especially relevant when we think about the tension between kind of intimacy and independence that I've been talking about, because a lot of times with this dismissive-avoidant attachment, you have this kind of impulse to shut down, armor up, run away when closeness feels threatening. And I think the Page of Cups teaches us again to meet that experience with some experimentation and curiosity. So yeah. And also like, I don't know, maybe even like naming something out loud. I think that when we're talking about, because the original question was, okay, how can I hold space for intimacy and autonomy? And I feel like the pages are also the archetypes that's kind of way more likely to just like say something without thinking. And in some cases, that's okay. So in this case, I would say the Page of Cups is saying, don't censor yourself when you are feeling something while you're engaging with your partner. Name it. Say, oof, this feels tense, or I'm feeling this urge to run away right now, or I'm feeling this urge to just shut down. And I think owning that is so important and is what really strengthens relationships and ends up increasing our ability to kind of maintain that emotional intimacy with somebody. So yeah, now that I'm kind of processing this out loud, I feel like the page is saying this is a way for us to rediscover or even just discover new parts of ourselves that either we haven't been aware of or that we've maybe just been too afraid to let be seen. So yeah, next time you want to shut down or you're afraid of being seen, I'm going to encourage you to think of the Page of Cups and just allow the situation to happen and hold it with some curiosity and some softness. Thank you so much for listening to the Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow the Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.